Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to cover an article. WWE's The Bloodline storyline displays toxic masculinity. From March 28, 2024 by a man by the name of James Stainings. We're going to go through this and talk about the toxic masculinity of the Bloodline. And hopefully have some fun. Maybe, something interesting will fall out of this. Before we get into this article, I do want to peep something that I thought was very, very interesting. And that is, there's a section in here called Prestige TV, where they start discussing whether, how WWE has tapped into something like The Sopranos, which is like a long form, episodic nature of storytelling. But in his conception of the toxic masculinity, he says, quote, "Credit where it's due. WWE for a time found a way to feel like, in part, like The Sopranos, like Breaking Bad or Goodfellas. At points, the storyline has been, and perhaps is, for some still spellbinding. Yet, just like those shows or films, it presents toxic masculinity as dangerous, but never outright denies calling it out as poisonous." Well, here's the thing. All of those shows have the same thing in common with WWE's Bloodline, and that is everybody involved is a heel. All right? They're the bad guys. You're not supposed to like them. Now, I know that in The Sopranos and in Goodfellas, these are the point of view characters. You live through the life of the villains of Goodfellas, the guys who murder people, right? The guys who steal. You're living through their lives, and you're supposed to look at them as sort of tragic characters. And that's kind of how the Bloodline is. You're supposed to look at Roman Reigns as a tragic character, for the most part. A guy who could have had it all, or who has the ability to have it all, but is doing things this way, which is not always necessary. But when you're talking about heels, you're not positioning this as being a good thing. So as we go through this, just keep it in mind. Nowhere in this storyline is Roman Reigns positioned as being a good guy. He's being positioned as being a bad guy. So we're going to get into the definition of toxic masculinity, some of the things that he discusses in the article. But I just wanted to get that part out first. That, toxic masculinity is dangerous, but you have to mention that it's poisonous. Well, poison is dangerous. Isn't that good enough? I guess not. But so let's get into this thing. All right, so let's get into what the toxic masculinity. How does he define the term? He says, quote, "Toxic masculinity is the concept that men must conform to old-fashioned, imperfect, and harmful ideals of manliness. Don't cry, don't show emotion because it's a weakness. Have no feelings, don't complain if you're hurt. Suck it up and be a man. Be always a strong man. Display power and control always. To do otherwise is to be weak. There are do's as well as don'ts. Men must live up to extreme cultural ideas of masculinity. Be strong and decisive. Display power and control always. Women, children, and men, viewed as betas, are subordinate. Men shall have authority over them. You must be athletic and muscular body type. It's acceptable for men to use violence. You must be the best. You must be masculine in everything you do. Demand respect. And if they do not have it, use power to attain it. These standards are impossible to achieve, misguided, and cause mental, emotional, and physical harm. The pressure to live up to rigid and unrealistic expectations of manhood kills men." All right, so, oh brother. Look, look at the flip side of all of the things that he mentioned. This is one of the things I learned from reading Jack Donovan. And you know what? I'll pull Jack Donovan into this eventually, some of the stuff that I've read. But let's flip some of these things that he says. Just look at the opposite side. Don't cry. All right, so the opposite would be crying, right? So is there positives to crying? Yes, there are positives to crying. Should you be a crybaby? No. Should you cry as much? And what is crying, really? It is a release of sadness. It is a release of pent-up frustrations sometimes. And yes, there is a positive to that, but not crying is about self-control. What does it mean when you don't have any control over yourself? Is that a sign of strength and of being a better man, to lack control over yourself? I don't know. Don't show emotion because it's a weakness. Well, I don't think anybody's arguing that you should be a stoic. People are just saying have control over your emotions. No outbursts. Outbursts of rage, outbursts of tears, but it's also culturally acceptable for men to have outbursts of happiness. Your favorite team ever won a game, you've been happy. Nobody ever shamed you for being an outburst of happiness, but people will shame you for outbursts of rage, which could end up with you in jail or being socially ostracized, or in interpersonal relationships, having no control over your emotions such as sadness. So really, when you talk about emotions, you're only really talking about two things. One is rage and the other is sadness, which are two things that men are being asked to control. Have no feelings. Again, we just talked about that. Don't complain if you're hurt. Well, you can complain if you're hurt. You just can't dwell on being hurt. It can't be helped if you're injured or if you're sick in some way. Those things cannot be helped. However, people do not want to hear about your ailments, especially when they have injuries or issues of their own. There's only so much of that stuff they can deal with at one time. Let's see. Suck it up and be a man. Well, everybody should suck it up eventually. Even women, Even women don't want to hear that from other women, Be always a strong man. Okay. Should you be a weak man? What is the positives to being a weak man? Display power and control always. Now, this is just flat out false. You don't need to exert power or control over anyone in order to be a man. So, or even to be a strong man. You should just, what they say in the PUAs, maintain frame. Basically, maintain what you can do and control over yourself and over what you have control over. It doesn't necessarily mean control other people. It just means if those people will not conform to what you want to do, you just don't deal with them, which sounds perfectly fine because this is what you're telling men in terms of women. If a woman is not with a man who is going to respect her boundaries, which includes maybe consent or about, public displays of affection or language or something like that, then anybody would tell her to leave. So why wouldn't a man do the same thing? Why would, if you tell a man, hey, these are the boundaries you have set, maintain your boundaries. If somebody violates those boundaries, why wouldn't you tell them to push that person away? That's common sense. So, just looking at these things, it makes no sense that you would argue that the opposites are good things, with the exception of maybe crying, which, is a very important outburst for men to have from time to time. He starts talking about a stiff upper lip, which is the same article he quoted in his Hangman Page piece. We're going to skip through that and he says, family members directly and indirectly are exposed to suffering due to men pursuing and enforcing these toxic traits. I guess, but is your family going to be better off if you are pursuing and exerting quote unquote non-toxic traits? We'll talk about that in a second too. He says, quote, the head of household knows best. The stereotype of the toxic male patriarch is domineering and authoritative, a bully who controls loved ones through physical, verbal, or mental abuse. He says, jump, and the reply is how high? One man is responsible. One man makes decisions. Okay. It's not like the 1920s or anything like that. So again, I don't know who's making this argument. Just because you are expected to be the responsible party in these situations, well, that's mostly due to cultural norms. Anytime you try to hold a woman responsible for anything, she blames her parents, she blames her baby daddy, she blames her upbringing, she blames a bunch of other people. A man isn't given that opportunity to, well, unless, he's men of a certain race. then you can blame other people for all of the problems that you have in life, which is not masculine. It's actually boy behavior, but whatever. He says, quote, "What drives a man to this level of control? Not having enough control." Okay, let's see if he fleshes this out. In storyline, Reigns has experienced betrayal from teammates and his fans, and it's fed his insecurity because Reigns was not accepted as the man by fans like they were supposed to. Okay, so he's saying that the core of the character is insecurity, which I think a lot of people have caught up on by this point. Is Roman is very paranoid, and he's very controlling. He's very abusive and manipulative. And the manipulative element is actually far more present than the abusive element. The exploitative element is far stronger than the abuse. The physical abuse of, beating people into conformity, that's it's there, it's present, but the emotional exploitation of the relationship between himself and the Usos, especially, was what actually gripped people in the story. Not necessarily that he was bullying them and pushing them around, which is typical heel behavior. It was that he was almost daring them to destroy the family, and he basically held the family over their head as a way to exploit and extract from the Usos. So that's an okay point, but there was certainly a level of insecurity there for Roman. So I'll give him some element of that. He says, when Reigns returned to win the Universal Championship at Payback 2020, things had to be different. Reigns' character became all about family because family, as we were told since birth, is what's most important. He starts talking about the feud with Jey Uso. That the family became justification to build a shield around insecurity, to protect a fragile ego who wanted from his family, the fans, every other man, the same thing, acknowledgement. Now, this is a good point, because this element of Roman's insecurity and paranoia, of finally being seen as the success that he's always supposed to be, because he is a child of destiny. He was supposed to be the hero, the successor to John Cena, and instead he went the opposite direction and became the big bad villain rather than being the big hero, which is much like the guy from Beauty and the Beast, who was supposed to be the big hero of the tribe, but he became obsessive and narcissistic, and he obsessed over Belle to the point where he led to his own destruction. And that's a similar thing here, where Roman, became so obsessed with his own control over the championship and his family, etc., that it led to his own downfall. And he quotes Paul Heyman by saying that the tribal chief needs acknowledgement. This is a declarative statement. This is the definition of the character. What does the character want? What does the tribal chief need? What does the head of the table seek? Acknowledgement, and it's emotional. So Paul Heyman was absolutely correct, because Paul Heyman is the guy who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the archetype for this character, and it's probably the guy doing most of the research and coming up with all of this stuff. He starts discussing the catchphrase, which is of course acknowledge me, and then he quotes Heyman again by saying, quote, he's needy, talking about Roman. He needs you to acknowledge him. Please acknowledge me. I'm not here for your love. I'm not here for your affirmation. I'm not here for you to chant my name. I just need you. It's unbelievable. It's puts power in the audience to react any way they want. Anyway, they want to boo me, boo me. You want to cheer me, cheer me. There's no command. It's a plea from a man who doesn't beg, from a man who rules, from a man who commands the island of relevancy. Please acknowledge me. Please. Just acknowledge me. It's all I need. I don't just want it. I need it from you. Again, Paul understands where he's going with this and what they're doing. And it's all fallen in the king archetype that we've been discussing. Every time I just talk about the character of Roman Reigns, I end up talking about the king archetype, which we're going to talk about again in a few minutes. So then James says, the paradox is the assertion of power comes from feeling weak. The need to control comes from feeling out of control. Insecurity, fear, and powerlessness mean what is in the alpha male's control must be controlled. Their family and possessions are his property. All will serve his will. Again, this is not entirely true that you need to control every single thing in order to be considered a man or a real man or whatever, because you can't control the behavior of other people. You can only control your reaction to those people's behavior. Yes, there are people who are trying to tell you that you should, how to manipulate others, the 48 laws of power, or Machiavelli, the prince, that teaches you how to play human chess, how to get people to react to things and how to exploit weaknesses and things like that. But most people don't involve themselves in that kind of stuff. Those are really high level, pretty much over the top concepts that most people don't ascribe to. So I wouldn't necessarily just dump that into this character. He continues. Was Roman before 2020 weak and powerless? Some kind of inferior man? Like some men who think they are weak and powerless and who buy into the promise of toxic masculinity? No, he wasn't. It's a delusion. The fans booed because they were fed up with Roman must look strong. Roman was their heir apparent, the poster boy. We didn't want this because the character was flimsy. Yet, Reigns headlined 5 WrestleManias before becoming the tribal chief, far from weak in most folks' metrics. Was Roman weak during this time? Well, once you realize that Roman's character is about insecurity and paranoia, and his paranoia and insecurity was linked mostly to the betrayals that he had faced from Seth Rollins, then that weakness was never purged. He never dealt with being betrayed. He never dealt with being, stabbed in the back by somebody he referred to as a brother. Even though he's beaten up Seth Rollins 100 times, he's never fully dealt with it. He probably needs therapy. That's what this guy would probably say, right? He says, quote, the character is deluded and can't see the privilege gifted to him because there is one thing he couldn't have, one thing he could not control. So to be the best, Reigns manufactures a new reality for himself and his family. Reigns' character insulated his ego, using his family as protection. This kind of fragility is at the core of toxic masculinity. Yet, despite Heyman's later assertions, it's something we've seen before. He starts talking about Triple H. So, Roman not being able to control the audience. Well, Cena also wasn't able to control the audience. And yet he almost unanimously gets huge reactions, positive reactions now. So it's not necessarily that Roman couldn't control the audience. It's that he decided to give the audience what they wanted. The audience wanted to hate him. He gave them a reason to hate him. At first, they had no real reason to hate him. They were manufacturing reasons to hate him. He decided he was going to give you a reason to hate him. You don't like me? You don't respect me? Okay, now maybe if I do all of this stuff, you'll get what you want, which is to hate me, but I'll still be successful. The paradox really is that everybody hated Roman being a top guy, but Roman was still the top guy when he was the top heel. He was just a heel. So it wasn't the argument that they didn't like Roman Reigns. It's that they didn't like Roman Reigns as a babyface, which is one of those things that's just neither here nor there as far as I'm concerned. If the guy is on top, it doesn't really matter if he's a heel or a babyface. So he starts breaking down prestige television shows like The Sopranos and how WWE has managed to tap into a certain element of that for their program on SmackDown. He continues by saying, listening to Heyman, you'd think it was obvious how weak and pathetic Reigns' tribal chief is. That each week he is losing control. 9 months later, things have changed. Chinks in the armor were there. Backstage and at points in the ring, he has looked vulnerable. Those dips of powerlessness have felt like a temporary blip. He says, he talks about Cody Rhodes and Jey Uso and Sami Zayn all getting the upper hand on Roman. He says, but then Roman retains his championships. The Bloodline assures victory regardless. retain the championship for a record amount of time. You know, then he says, without the dips and suspense, some fans have become desensitized. Nothing has changed. Roman must look strong. Okay? Well, when you're building something and the storyline is as the bloodline is, then yeah, you don't want Roman to lose every big match, because then the character looks weak. And if the character looks weak, he can't draw money. So Roman has to win, but he does look weak because he cheats so much, because there's so much help. That, in a sense, gives the babyfaces some level of hope that they could have beaten Roman Reigns one-on-one in a singles match. Finn Balor could have beaten him. Drew McIntyre could have beaten him. Sami Zayn could have beaten him. If you go back and watch all of these matches, Jey Uso could have beaten him. Roman was beating all of these matches until the bloodline jumps in and helps him. Because the goal is to get Roman to a certain point and then take it all away. That's not a problem, all right? That's actually how storylines like this should be constructed. So he continues saying, the bloodline story has gone on longer than any Shakespearean play without the constant threat of downfall. Shoosh. He says, booking wise, the babyfaces have looked weak and not being prepared for the interference that cost them their chances. This obviously was written before WrestleMania 40. Good guys, the newer, more modern, masculine figures like Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, oh my God, had a WrestleMania moment but fell down the card before the unbeatable villain. The WWE authority figures have proven themselves enablers, allowing alpha male behavior to hold them to ransom. But then, this was a storyline created by an alpha male who reportedly had to control all aspects of creative, a man who cannot stand being ill, let alone sneezing, because he cannot control it. Okay, so you want to put the heat on the managers, the general managers, put the heat on the referees and all this kind of stuff, because they should be ready, they should be prepared. Yeah, I think that there should have been things at some point where that was taken into account, especially when it came to the second or third match in a series where, guys should have been banned from ringside. That's a booking issue there, more of a storyline issue. It has nothing really to do with toxic masculinity. It just kind of has an issue that the creative team overlooked by not having Roman wrestle a guy 2 or 3 times, and then you ban the bloodline from ringside, and then Roman just beats the guy because he can. That kind of thing needed to occur, and I will agree with that. He says that the storyline presents toxic masculinity as dangerous, but never outright denies calling it poisonous. All right, so that's essentially a rundown of the article. It wasn't as humorous as the article on the modern masculinity involving the anxious millennial cowboy. So he noted something that is obviously true. Roman Reigns is playing up what they call the king archetype. The king archetype, go watch my WWE Evil video on Roman Reigns, so I won't have to go over this all over again. But to give you a summary of what it is, the king is the medium between the mortal and divine worlds, archetypally, of course. The king is divined by God, which means he's put in position. The tribal chief is a king. He is a leader of men on the island of relevancy. The importance of the island of relevancy is that the king establishes boundaries. So because this king can establish boundaries and codify the law, because he's the king, then Roman Reigns makes the rules. So what is bloodline rules? As Paul Heyman says, bloodline rules is whatever Roman Reigns says it is. So at that point, you get that you're dealing with somebody who wields authority and wields power and is doing so in a way to benefit himself. Now, when you look at the king, okay, as an archetype, one thing that the king always is supposed to do is he's supposed to be a fertility god almost, a fertility god on earth. It is time for the king to make sure that the land and the people are flourishing. Otherwise, you have revolution. So it's up to Roman to make sure that the Usos are still doing well, that they're the tag team champions, that Solo is winning his matches, that everything is going on well, because if everybody's benefiting, then they're more willing to stay loyal to him. But when things are not going well, when things are falling apart, they start fighting each other. So it was in Reigns' best benefit to maintain his relationship with the Usos by having them, giving them a mission and giving them the resources needed to be the tag team champions and to stay that way. Because you notice, as soon as the Usos lost the tag team titles, they started infighting. Because now the Usos don't have anything. They have no reason to be good knights for the king. They have no reason to uphold the law of the island of relevancy. And you see that a lot in a lot of our societies today, when you have a lot of young men who are not involved in society, you know, the incels or the guys who can't find work, the NEETs, all these kinds of guys, you know, the MGTOWs, they basically just float away. They don't care if the country falls apart. They don't care if it burns and dies because they are not invested. It was in Roman Reigns' best interest to keep the Usos invested in the story. Now, he did that through abuse, through violence, through verbal humiliation, through mental abuse. This is because Roman Reigns was embodying what we call the tyrant. This is the archetype, the active pole of the archetype. This comes from the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. And Roman Reigns is very self-interested. He's a narcissist. Acknowledge me. That's what that's about, right? He exploits people. He's abusive to them. He's aggressive. He's always angry. He's always yelling at these guys. But he also expects them to imitate him. Their behavior, their wins and losses are a reflection on Roman Reigns. And this is something that he discusses with, I think it was might have been Jay, where, you know, he saw Jay as a reflection of himself. To put your hands on Jay is to put your hands on Roman. You know, you offend him, you offend me. You know, you offend him, you offend my family. So that kind of thing. But there's also what's called a passive pole. And the passive pole to the king archetype is called the weakling. And this is where Roman, in the later part of his title run, started actually taking over. This is where he became more insecure and more paranoid. He became a little bit more hostile, but he also became more defensive. He lacked compassion, unlike earlier in the storyline when he was feigning compassion. You know, he pretended like he really did care about the Usos, you know, especially during the I Quit match between him and Jay. He pretended that he actually cared about them. Later on, he would, of course, not care about them at all. But mostly he projected his weakness onto others. When Roman was feeling down and out, he mostly just abused the Usos because that actually made him feel better. Because it was somebody he could bully, somebody he could push around. This was not seen as something positive because Roman Reigns is a heel. And that's really what we get into with this whole nonsense. 25 minutes. And it's pretty common sense, right? He's not a babyface. He's a heel, right? So none of this is seen as positive. The fact that Roman Reigns is abusive and exploitative to the Usos, it doesn't matter because he's a heel. This stuff is not meant to be positive. This stuff is meant to be negative. But let's talk about the alpha male stuff. Because this is where I actually want to get into Jack Donovan's book, The Way of Men. In Jack Donovan's book, Jack Donovan wrote about 4 concepts we call the 4 alpha virtues. Strength, courage, mastery, and honor. And I'm going to give you a short description of each one of these things to describe how somebody who would not care if you called him a toxic masculine male would look at a situation that this James Steining's guy would complain about. One is strength. Okay? Strength is mostly about the ability to exert muscular force, right? The ability to force people to do things through physicality. And as Jack Donovan mentions in his book, strength is very rarely a disadvantage. How are you ever at a disadvantage for being strong? You know, it's to the benefit of you, your family, your group. And that's how Jack Donovan defines masculinity, as a group issue, which I kind of disagree with. But let's just go with it since I'm using him as a source. It benefits your group for you to be strong, right? Physically strong. That you have to exert your will over yourself, number one, nature, and others. This may seem on the surface like he agrees with James with this, that he wants you to control other people, but this is about advancing your own interests. All right, this is not about just having control over others. It's about, do you have the physical abilities to advance your own interests? In other words, if you need to go hunt, can you do that? If you need other people to go hunt, do you know how to control nature? Do you know how to build a tent, start a fire? All these sorts of things that may require strength, that may require other things. Do you have that ability? And strength is the one thing, according to Jack Donovan, that allows the other virtues to exist, because it's the foundation. If you're physically strong, and all of this is relative, of course. I'm not saying everybody has to be Brock Lesnar. But if you're physically strong, then you can uphold your other values. And that allows the group to rise in prominence. So the second would be courage. Courage, of course, is measured against danger. So he says, the greater the danger, the greater the courage. And that one person needs to realize how to take risks. Not just for yourself, but also for your group. You have to learn how to make sacrifices. Now, does this sound like something that is toxic? Telling people that they need to learn how to take sacrifices, how to take risks, how to put your life on the line for the group? That's not something I'm actually a big fan of, actually, But sometimes it's necessary. If, something's happening in your home and you're in your home with your wife and your children, who's going to be the guy that's going to have to go get up and do something? It has to be you. Otherwise, you're going to nudge your wife and say, get up, and there's a burglar in the house. I mean, does that sound like a recipe for a successful relationship? Come on, that's ridiculous, right? So it's also about what he calls gameness in the book, which some of us will call it heart. It is about the ability and the willingness to fight. This is a big thing when it comes to courage. Is a man willing to fight? Is he willing to get into a physical confrontation in which he may have to use his strength? This is the pole where a lot of people fail, because our society is now diminishing physical strength, and it's becoming more about tattletelling. Run and tell your boss, run and tell your teacher, run and tell the principal or whatever that somebody's picking on you. The idea that you should fight for yourself, stand up for yourself, those things are being downgraded in our society now. So that's very unfortunate. But the third point is mastery, basic competence. What is your skill set? How are you contributing to the group's success? And the fourth is honor. Honor is respect. It is linked highly to your morality. It is acknowledging your accomplishments and respecting your status. It is hierarchical. And this is where a lot of people also have a problem, because they don't like hierarchies. They don't like the idea of some person being better than others. But it's necessary in terms of the flourishing of any group. You should always have somebody who is the person you could look to and say, you have better information. You're stronger. You're a better tactician, or you're wiser. How do we fix this situation? Those people should always exist, and you should always venerate those people. So when you look at the Bloodline story, you talk that Roman Reigns, of course, is about physical strength. You can just look at him and tell that he's a strong guy. Then is he courageous? Well, he's a heel, so he's not as courageous as he should be, but he's willing to face out all comers. He's willing to fight Brock Lesnar 4 times. So he's showing some level of courage. Is he having mastery? Yes. Well, he's a really good pro wrestler in terms of kayfabe. He knows what he's doing, and he's exceptional at what he's doing, because that's why he manages to win all the time. And the fourth thing is honor, respect. This is the weak point, because this is what Roman always wants. This is the one thing that he has been demanding with the acknowledge me. He wants you to acknowledge his accomplishments. He wants you to respect what he's done. And he hasn't been getting it up to that point where he started yelling about it. And now maybe he does. So is the bloodline toxically masculine? Well, to a degree, I'll actually say yes, but it's being promoted as heel virtues, when if you actually flip them, ask yourself, how is being weak beneficial? How is being dependent beneficial? How is, these guys deal in a business of fighting. What are they going to do? Sit down and have a therapy session and talk it out, and all of a sudden the show is going to end because Jay and Roman sat down and talked out their feelings? Is that what you wanted? SummerSlam featuring Dr. Phil. Sounds pretty ridiculous, right? But let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah. We just gonna